The 1960s were a time of great change in New York City. There were the hippies, the old-timers, and there were the artists. Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, these were the big names of the pop art era. But across the country, change was brewing in the art world, and New York City was the epicenter of that transition. The shift from art being high class to high crime. One day, people in the neighborhood of Inwood noticed a strange tag appearing on walls all over town. It read Julio 204. The tag seemed very cryptic. Locals thought it was a message that needed to be decoded, but it was much more simple than that. Julio 204 was a title, not a message. It was the name of the artist being spread all across the neighborhood, a simple statement of identity from a boy in the shadows. At that time, being a tag artist came at a great risk. To be caught tagging a building would leave one in handcuffs, and this fate met Julio 204. In 1970, he was arrested for vandalism and was found out to be a young Puerto Rican kid from Inwood. He retired and left his spray cans behind, choosing to remain anonymous and return to a normal life. But that wasn't the end, for he had inspired one of the greatest graffiti artists of all time. This artist was Tacky 183. Tacky 183, like Julio 204, was at first a mystery to the people in New York City, although after some time they became very aware of his presence. They saw him going to work, they saw him on the subway, they saw him everywhere. Tacky 183 wasn't just a person after a certain point. The tag took on a personality of its own, an identity the whole city recognized. It was rebellion and art all wrapped up in 7 characters. After a while, the veil was lifted slightly as the artist would be revealed as a Greek teenager who went by the name Dimitraki and lived on 183rd Street in Washington Heights. Following his tentative step into public life, graffiti as a whole got recognition on the national stage. The New York Times published an article in 1971 titled Tacky 183 Spawns Pen Pals. It featured an interview with the secretive tag artist, and in it, he even cited Julio 204 as an inspiration for his work. He aspired to take what Julio did and make it bigger, much bigger. Julio 204 was a name known across a single borough, while Tacky 183 was known across the entire city. By the mid-70s, graffiti had become a mainstay in New York City. Everywhere you looked, there it was. But things had changed. Where it all started out with walls full of tags, simple letters and numbers put together hastily, now it had become full-fledged artwork. Things had evolved and grown bigger, more colorful, more brash. Where the first steps of the art form looked like an expression of the anxiety that was integral to the act, now there was a newfound grace in the way graffiti artists expressed themselves. One of the first and most exciting forms of this was the introduction of Blockbuster letters. A tag took on a new form, one comprising of 3 dimensions with geometric shapes that flew off walls and subway cars across the city. The artist known to be the pioneer of this form was referred to as Blade. His real name was Stephen D. Ogburn, and today he is featured in galleries and is a respected artist among his peers. Nowadays he paints on a cotton surface and planks of wood, but in his youth, subway cars were his canvas. The subway system had no greater enemy than Ogburn. Unlike artists of the past who wrote their names on a wall that stands stagnant, his name traveled throughout every borough. The Blockbuster craze inspired many other artists as well. Lee Quinones was one who seized the new and upcoming style. His most infamous piece was found on a handball court outside 56 Corliers Junior High School on the Lower East Side. It was titled Howard the Duck. The eye-popping mural featured a scared Howard shielding himself from the artist's tag exploding towards him. But the real part of the piece that left everyone talking wasn't the drawing itself. It was the text that lay behind Howard's head, a declaration from the artist himself which read, "Graffiti is art, and if art is a crime, let God forgive all." Late 70s, graffiti had started to earn a new kind of reverence in the art world. But by the 1980s, graffiti artists demanded respect. One of the artists who would be most effective in attaining it would be Keith Haring. Haring was a Pennsylvania native growing up in a very conservative religious family. He was otherworldly compared to the people who surrounded him in his youth. He was an artist. When he got old enough, he hitchhiked across the country in search of himself. He finally settled in New York City in the late 70s to study at the School of Visual Arts. In the Big Apple, Herring had a newfound freedom and the perfect location to exercise it. While taking the subway one day, he discovered a new venue for his work. There were blackboards hanging in the tunnels that were used to house advertisements. One day, Herring noticed that one laid empty and he saw an opportunity. He started creating his compositions on these blackboards and left them to be seen by the throngs of daily commuters. Herring had developed his own unique style, one focused on simplicity and movement. He used bubbly stick figures and created grand arrangements filled with color and motion. As his work became more prominent in the city's art scene, so did Herring himself. He had amassed respect among his peers and was becoming a celebrity. This led to what is now known as one of the first official exhibits to be held for graffiti. It wasn't in the Museum of Modern Art of the Metropolitan. It was in one of the most dirty, grungy, and exclusive clubs in New York City. It was held in the Mud Club. Located in Tribeca in Lower Manhattan, the club was a lightning rod for unique figures. Artists, musicians, club kids, and anyone who had the credentials to get in. Herring hosted the Beyond Words exhibit, which displayed work from various artists like Zephyr, Lee Quinones, and Eric Hayes. This exhibit represented more than just a collection of great artists. It was the evolution of an art form, from being a criminal offense to being considered a legitimate part of the culture, one that sprouted from the city streets and ascended to great heights. With the end of the 1980s came the end of the golden era of graffiti in New York City. Ed Koch and Metro North joined together on a mission to rid the subway cars of all the tags and big blockbuster letters that had adorned them for years. This left many artists without their greatest canvas. Over time, while tags and compositions could still be found, it wasn't the giant tidal wave of art that had been popping up and gaining momentum. Now, it was much more like small waves collecting on the edge of the tide. Then, far away in the United Kingdom, came the new poster boy for the art form, the anonymous, elusive Banksy. Banksy was like a relic from graffiti's past, sneaking out at night and doing his work in a feverish haze. Each piece had a grungy feel, but were filled with heart and messages that left people staring at them as they walked by. Very quickly, Banksy became a global sensation. In his home country, he had amassed wealth through selling some of his canvassed work. But despite all the riches and fame, he kept his identity and personal life to himself. His love for graffiti shined through everything he did, and in 2013, he decided to come to the big city for a month-long residency. Every day he spent in New York City, he left a new piece to adorn the streets. His works were varied and iconic. A boy with a hammer pointed directly at a fire hydrant. The addition of the Words the Musical to pieces of amateur graffiti around the city, and a moving truck that traveled throughout the boroughs with the trunk open displaying a full exhibit inside. Every day people waited to spot the new Banksy piece. The month had gone by like a dream, with each day becoming increasingly surreal. But like all good things, Banksy's stay in New York had to end. Like every other graffiti artist in the Big Apple, he had left his mark on the streets, on the walls of the buildings he tagged, on the minds of every passerby that stopped for that extra second to be part of something bigger than themselves. He brought back a version of New York City that many had seemingly forgotten, the concrete jungle of days past that had served as a gallery for graffiti's greatest pioneers, a home for the anonymous, the brash, the innovators, and the youth that are left to carry that torch. And when it's all said and done, when these legends move on to whatever comes next after this life, they'll always be remembered as the spray can angels, beacons of light that made the whole city shine.